Oh, hello friends, Ginny D here. In the original version of this video, this contained sparkling water, just in a thematically relevant cup. But then, I spent an hour recording this entire video without my mic plugged in. So now it's full of alcohol. Today, I wanted to tell you about my experience working for the Renaissance Festival. A little bit of a story time. God, I just did this. April is in my mistress' face. April is in my mistress' face. April is in my mistress' face. And July in her eyes hath placed. And July in her eyes hath placed. So I worked at the Colorado Renaissance Festival for 2 summers, 2009 and 2010. And my first summer, the summer of 2009, was my last summer before college. Working at the Renaissance Festival was really formative for me. It introduced me to geek culture and conventions, so it's really one of the reasons why I am where I am today. And it was also really instrumental in building my confidence and teaching me some stuff about myself. And it was crazy. Ren fairs are crazy. I first went to the Colorado Renaissance Festival when my family moved to Colorado from Virginia when I was in 4th grade, so I was pretty young the first time I went. Of course, being me, I went there and really enjoyed it, so I went home and organized my own Renaissance Festival in my backyard, which I invited my neighbors to and charged entry for. In the years after that, I went most summers either with my family and then later with my friends. Once I got to high school, there were times when my parents would drop off me and my friends at the Renaissance Festival and then leave and then come back and pick us up at the end of the day. I think they thought of it as a very sort of wholesome state fair type contained experience. I think if they'd have known what I now know about the Renaissance Festival atmosphere, they would not have been comfortable doing that. During high school, I started singing in choirs and I started taking voice lessons, and music and singing became a much bigger part of my life. And so naturally, when I went to the Renaissance Festival the summer before my senior year and I saw a group of women singing at the fair in beautiful medieval dresses, singing songs with harmonies and stuff, I was like, singing things, I know that. I'm gonna go show them that I know singing things. So I started talking to them. I think my opener was asking them about how they sing in corsets, because I, at the time, had not worn a corset, and I just sort of bought into the general media idea that corsets were torture devices that crushed women's bodies instead of what they actually are, which is a structured undergarment, like a bra. And while we were talking about singing, they mentioned to me that they would be losing a few members the following summer, and that if I wanted to come audition, maybe I could sing with them the following year. I invited a few of my friends from choir to audition with me, and there were 2 girls that were going to audition with me, and then by the time the actual auditions rolled around, both of them had bailed. In fact, I think one of them bailed, I thought she was supposed to be coming to the auditions, and I showed up at the auditions and she just wasn't there. And the Ren Fair people were like, "Where's your friend?" And I was like, "But I don't know." So it ended up being just me. I walked into this little office and I sang a cappella a few verses of Scarborough Fair. That was the most medieval song that I knew. I was just singing a cappella for the other girls that were remaining in the group and the entertainment director, who I don't believe knew really anything about music. So it was more about just impressing the other girls and making them feel like they wanted to sing with me. It's funny because I feel like I was so nervous about it, but at that point I had auditioned for and gotten into All-State Jazz Choir, which is much more difficult and higher stakes audition. This was, I think they pretty much just needed to make sure that I could carry a tune. I was basically hired on the spot. So we started rehearsing. We actually started rehearsing long before the rest of the Ren Fair cast began their rehearsals, because I was the only one in the group who didn't know all of these songs. I had to learn my part in their entire repertoire of songs. I was thinking, while I was prepping for this video, I was looking at old photos and videos of this group, and I realized that I have no idea what my character's name was. The way that it works when you're on the cast at the Renaissance Festival is that you create a character that exists in this fictional medieval world of Larkspurshire. The fair is in the city of Larkspur, so we referred to the town of the Renaissance Festival as Larkspurshire. Oh yes, welcome to Larkspurshire. Oh, here we are, we're in England. I remember all of the other girls' names. The other three girls were Sparrow, Nell, and Jane, and I have no idea what my character's name was. I think it was something Italian? Obviously didn't make an impression on me. We also renamed the group because I think that the 5 or 6 girls that were there the year before me had been singing together for multiple years, so it made sense that the name of the group that they had was like associated with those members, and with new members they wanted to have a new name, and we picked Foxglove, which I still actually really like. And then as we got closer to the beginning of the actual fair season, that was when the full cast rehearsals began, so we would all go down to Larkspur, we would go down to the fairgrounds and rehearse on the grounds. And by rehearsal, I just mean like we would collect together and like play a couple improv games and just kind of generally get to know each other and get comfortable with each other and get like into the Ren Fair spirit, I guess. There wasn't really a lot that happened at Colorado Fair that was like that required rehearsing, like lines or blocking or anything like that. Of course, within the Madrigal group, we mostly just continued rehearsing our songs, but other people were just sort of like, I think most people at rehearsals were just kind of like fucking around. I'm really bad at estimating numbers, but I feel like the cast during my year was probably like 30 to 40 people maybe. Eventually, we started the actual fair season, and at first I was so nervous about it because having attended the Renaissance Festival, I was fully aware of like how many people come through that fair, and I had never done anything like that before. Even my scripted acting experience was very, very limited, but improv on that scale I had never really done. I think one of the things that made me feel more comfortable and less nervous about it, though, was just being in the group with those other girls, because I was always with the Madrigals. It was always the 4 of us, and even if we split off into pairs, there was never a time when I was just like wandering around the Renaissance Festival alone, or at least that didn't happen at all until I was comfortable with it and like did that myself. It was also nice when just doing the whole improv thing to have these people around me who could sort of carry the burden of interaction with people if I ever wasn't sure what to say. We improved as a group. It also might be a little generous to call it improv because the kind of people who attend Renaissance Festival, most of them only say the same like 5 or 6 things to you. So once I had a few days under my belt, I felt like I sort of had like a script to deal with pretty much anything anybody could throw at me. People always think they're being creative, but they're really not. Like they'll ask you if your outfit is uncomfortable, they'll try and break you and get you to like admit that you don't really live in medieval England. We had certain bits that we just repeated over and over and over with like certain kinds of patrons. Like we had bits that we would do with young men. We had bits that we would do with couples. One of the first ones that I learned is that we would pick out a boy like age 16 or under, and then we would all sort of like cluster around him and be like, are you titled? Are you landed? Are you set to inherit quite a bit of money? Do you have a wife yet? Are you betrothed? And it was just this whole ongoing joke that like we were like well-to-do ladies who were desperate for husbands, and it was always safer to do those kind of bits with like a 13-year-old boy because he'd be embarrassed and his parents would laugh, as opposed to doing that bit with like an adult man who would sometimes see it as actual flirting, which is like a little riskier. Although it was generally easy to diffuse a too flirtatious situation with like an adult male by pretending that like you're rejecting him because he's not rich enough for you to marry, like it's not a good match. But like people drink there, and Ren Fair has a pretty sexually charged atmosphere, so there were definitely men who like crossed boundaries with us, which was also new for me. I do remember one specific time when this really drunk guy literally picked up one of the girls and threw her over his shoulder and like tried to walk out of the fair with her. Yikes. I feel like that kind of behavior is kind of encouraged by this like very irritating propensity that people have to refer to any woman at a Renaissance festival as a wench. But most of what we were doing wasn't improv bits with patrons, it was singing. Of course, we had little sets throughout the day, and sometimes we would do additional sets because we made most of our money from tips. The Renaissance Festival does not pay well. And we never were on a main stage or anything. We were just a little quartet that would go like stand by the fountain and sing songs for half an hour, or go stand under these trees by the pathway and sing songs. One of the things that was sort of sad is that our favorite songs to sing and some of the most beautiful pieces that we learned just like didn't grab people's attention and weren't good tip getters. So like as much as we wanted to sing Oh My Love's Like a Red Red Rose, the ones that would get tips were like Plucka.
She sat on the hillside and played her guitar, played her guitar. Pluck, 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 pluck.
which is not a medieval song, more like a Girl Scout camp kind of song. But it was like funny and people liked it and it would get us a lot of tips, so we sang it all the time. One of my favorite things about madrigals is that they are almost all filthy, but like in a sort of subtle way. Some of the songs we sang, for instance, were I'd Enter Your Garden, which is exactly what it sounds like. I'd enter your garden if I dare be so bold, for such blushing roses are fair to behold. Sweet maiden, let me pluck them. You know, that kind of thing. We had a song that we sang called Fair Phyllis, which is about a woman named Phyllis who is feeding her flock on the mountainside, and she wanders up and down, up and down, up and down over the hills, and then her lover Amyntas hies after her, and then they fall a-kissing, and then he wanders up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. Ah, good shit. One thing about working at fair is that they were long hours. They were long days. Fair would open at 9 or 10, I can't remember. We would show up an hour before that for a morning meeting where we would just all like touch base and make sure that everybody was there and blah, blah, blah. And then before that, of course, we had to get ready. So we'd be putting on these complicated costumes. We'd be putting on a full face of makeup. We'd be styling our hair. We didn't get a lunch break off site. Like at lunch, we would have an in-character picnic. We would go over by the joust field, we would lay out a blanket, and we would have a picnic with the princess and some of the other ladies from the court, where we would like recite poems and tell stories and tell jokes and sing songs and just sort of like play around in character while eating. And then at the end of the day, when it was time for people to leave, we would go stand by the gate and we would say goodbye to everybody as they were leaving. And then once everybody had left and the gates were closed, there was closing gate where we would all sort of stand around in a big half circle and sing a bunch of songs to close out the day for like half an hour. And then once all of that was done, we would stay there. A lot of us camped there. Some of us because they were traveling on the circuit, so they didn't actually live in Colorado. They were just here for the Renaissance Festival and they would camp throughout the whole season. And then some of us, I mean, I lived over an hour from the fairgrounds, so unless I wanted an hour-long commute, it was easier to just camp there Friday night and Saturday night and just already be on site. So needless to say, there was a lot of partying because there were just all of these Rennies like camping over the summer on the weekends. And by partying, I don't mean just like hanging out and getting drunk, although obviously that was a huge part of it, but like these are Ren Fair people. So we had themed parties throughout the entire summer. One of the women who ran a costume shop there would host a Bastille Day party every year that was a themed costume party. So we would like have this long day in costume, in character, and then we would go back to our tent and then change into a different costume and then go to the fairgrounds to her costume shop where she had moved all of the stuff out of the bottom level of the shop, and then we would just like party there until like 1 or 2 in the morning, and then the next day we would get up and put back on our costume and go work another day of the Renaissance Festival. I understand how I did it at 18, but I don't understand how there are all these like 45, 50-year-old Ren Fair people who have been doing this for decades who still have the energy to do that kind of thing. It's like, holy shit, I feel too old for that now. We had so many themed parties. I remember at one point we had like a luau party. There were a lot of in-jokes at fair, so one of them was that we were all of the women on cast were in a fake sorority called Phi Beta Femme, and all of the men were in a fake fraternity. I can't remember what theirs was called. Like, we actually had metal sorority pins that were created by one of the jewelry makers that worked at fair. So naturally, we had to have a toga party for the sorority and fraternity members. One thing that you have to remember is that, like, Ren Fair culture is very much centered around sex and alcohol in a lot of ways. And, like, going into this, not only was I only 18, but also I was naive even compared to other people my age. Boys really didn't like me in high school. I only had one boyfriend in high school. It was brief, it was not physical, and I was absolutely, completely opposed to drinking alcohol before I was 21. I was like a total square. And Ren Fair culture was like, everyone was flirting with each other in a really sexual way, nonstop, and everyone was drinking. I was really unused to people flirting with me. Like, that wasn't really something that I had experienced much before, but at fair, not only was I like new meat on cast, but also everybody just flirts with everybody. It isn't even necessarily an indicator of interest, but it was like a really different environment for me. It was very new. Over the course of my 2 summers working at fair, I dated 2 different Ren Fair guys, and I had many more very ill-advised crushes on others. Like, the first guy that I dated at fair, he started flirting with me at rehearsals rehearsals. It was like immediate. And he played the prince, and I was like, oh my God. The prince is going to fall in love with me and sweep me off my feet. And I like quickly learned that a lot of stuff that I sort of thought would be romantic was actually just super awkward. And like, he wasn't a prince. He was just like some nerd. He was some nerd who worked at Ren Fair just like me. I remember at one point he serenaded me, and it was just one of those things that's like, it sounds like it would be romantic, but when you're actually experiencing it, you're like, someone's singing straight at me. They're like looking in my eyes. What do I do? What do I do with my hands? Where do I look? Like, how do I react to this? This is so weird. Another guy that I dated at Fair took me on a date at Fair. Like, it was a Fair weekend, and on a Saturday night, he took me on a date. Like, we walked out onto the fairgrounds. And one really cool thing about Colorado Fair is that all the structures are permanent. So like, all of the shops and buildings are like real buildings that are there year round. And if you're a shopkeeper who has traveled from another fair, a lot of times they will stay in their shop over the weekend. So you'd be walking through the fairgrounds and there would be like lights on upstairs in some of the shops, and like occasionally you'd see people moving around. So it did in some ways really feel like you were walking through a real medieval village, which is cool. And I remember this guy like took me out into the middle of the jousting field and was like, imagine that I just jousted for your hand and I won, and the crowd is, everyone's cheering for us. And I think he thought that it would be this like romantic like journey of imagination together, and then we'd share like a dramatic kiss in the middle of the jousting field. But I just felt so uncomfortable. I was like, this is so awkward. And like, the level that Fair was on was so outside of my, even like my understanding. Like, I know there was at least one orgy that happened while I was there, not there. I did not attend. And when it came to the drinking thing, like, it's so funny. Everyone kept telling me that I was going to be pressured to drink in college. There's like this narrative that in college, people will pressure you to drink. I felt way more pressured to drink at the Renaissance Festival than I ever did in college. People would offer me alcohol and I would be like, oh, no, thank you, I'm not 21. And they would be like, it's okay, I won't tell anyone. And I'd be like, no, thank you, I don't want it. And they'd be like, just taste it. Like, just try it. Oh, just smell it. It actually really taught me some stuff about myself, because I had never really been in a position until Ren Fair where I felt pressured to do something that I was uncomfortable with. I don't know that anybody like meant to be an asshole about it. I think it was really unusual for somebody with my level of innocence to be involved with this. And looking back, I realized there are some things that I was uncomfortable with that I probably was making a big deal out of and that I could have chilled out about. But regardless of where I was drawing my boundaries and why, I am actually like really proud of me, of like little 18-year-old me, for being willing to draw those boundaries and keep them. I didn't really know until then that that's the kind of person I was, so it was like a real self-discovery thing for me. I made friends at Fair that literally changed the direction of my life, but I also never really bought into Fair culture, I think, the way that some people do. And it's not that everybody who works at Fair buys into that culture, and I was like the only one that didn't. There are plenty of people who just have a job at Fair for like a fun summer job, but there are also people who center their entire life around the Renaissance Festival. There are people who do, it's called the circuit, where you go from one fair to whatever fair starts soonest after that one ends. So I think that most people went from Colorado to Minnesota, and I'm not sure what the full circuit was, but there are people who literally just go from fair to fair to fair to fair year round, and that's their whole job. But even though that was never going to be me, I was never going to like be a Rennie, I am so glad that I had that experience. It was so important to me. I was there as like, I was at a transition point. I was right between high school and college, and like, this is maybe cliche, but at 18, like you're at this point where you're figuring out what it means to be an adult. I had never really felt like attractive or sexy before. No one had ever really made me feel that way. So that was like really a shift for me. It was the first time I'd ever really thought of myself in those terms. And as someone who has always been a card-carrying member of the Itty Bitty Titty Committee, wearing a corset was like, oh, there they are, they exist. Another thing is that just that group of the madrigals was really important to me. Up until that point, I had been like in friend circles, but I had always felt like I was a little bit of an outsider within them. I had been sort of on the periphery of any group that I was in. And the Madrigals were like, we were such a close knit group. We were like our own little pod within the Renaissance Festival cast. And I had never really felt like I was part of something like that before. And that was really important to me. I think what I miss most about Fair, if I miss anything, is just singing in a group. Like I feel so lucky that I get to sing as part of my work now on this YouTube channel, but there's something so magical about being with a group of people where you all know the different parts of a song and together you can create like a beautiful piece of music from nothing. These days, I don't really do fair stuff anymore. I'm not really close with very many people from my Ren Fair days. I've still been a few times over the last few years, but I admit that some of the magic of the Ren Fair has sort of like been dispelled by the fact that I know all about it behind the scenes now. Although I still would really like to go to more fairs in other states. I got to be on guest cast at Scarborough Fair in Texas, I think in 2010, and Scarborough is like magical. I would love to go back there. Have you ever been to a Renaissance festival? What is your local fair like? Have you ever worked at a Renaissance festival? I would love to hear about your Ren Fair thoughts in the comments. I'm so annoyed because I feel like there are things I said in the first version of this that were like funny or interesting and I just like didn't remember them because it was totally unscripted and now it's lost to my microphone failures.